Okay, we're slightly over time, so I'd like to call the last session. I'd like to call the last session for today to begin, please. On my left, it's a great pleasure to introduce Neta Crawford, who's Professor of International Relations at Brown University, and she's going to be talking about Man in the Mirror, Human Nature and World Politics. On my right is not Jean Elshtain. Some of you, in light of the earlier session, some of you might think you've got the wrong model in your head, but you haven't. This is actually Professor Brown from the London School of Economics, and he's going to be giving. You'll be reading the paper or giving a summary of the paper, or
yes.
So, yes. Chris is going to be speaking to Jean Elshtain's paper. Unfortunately, Jean Elshtain is unwell and not able to make it, but it's very nice that Chris is going to give us a version of her paper, and we can have an interesting discussion afterwards. The order is going to be Chris going first, and then followed by Neta. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much. Yes, anyone who makes sexist cracks about me not being Jean, that means you, Boris, is out. I was kind of emailed last week and asked by Jean to present this. In a way, it's a great honour. I mean, I've known Jean is a good friend of mine. I've known her since 1981, when I went for 1 year to the University of Massachusetts, which at that stage, UMass Amherst, at that stage, I think had probably pound for pound the best political theory group in the country. They had Jean, Felix Oppenheimer from the older generation, and Bill Connolly. And Connolly and Elshtain then moved on to other things, but I've kept contact with Jean ever since, and so I count her as a friend. And I agree with her on most things except the God business, which is a bit of a problem, and unfortunately that's absolutely central to her. So in practice I don't really agree with her on things. I would agree with her if it wasn't for these minor technical issues. So in a way I was quite pleased to be asked to present the paper, but it is a tricky business, because if you've read the paper you'll know it's not the kind of paper that you can really, it's not set out in such a way that you can really present it in quite the way that she, certainly nowhere near the way she would have done. It's a meditation, she says at one stage, on various themes, and you can present somebody's paper but you can't really meditate for them. That sounds so what I'll present the argument, which I think is actually quite well structured, although at times it doesn't look it. You have to read it 2 or 3 times to see the structure. But I'll also, in a way, kind of comment a bit on it, not in any hostile way, but just explicatory comments for my benefit as much as anybody else's, and see if I really agree. So no attempt at ventriloquism. Even if I had time to read the paper, it wouldn't work, basically, because there's too many kind of illusions in it that only Jean could do. So Jean was which I didn't know before this, was a student of Ken's in the 1960s, and so has an interest in from that angle. She's also, of course, a major political theorist who wrote books within the field of gender, and she's also contributed substantially to gender and war studies. And the way the paper is designed is an attempt to read Ken's 3 images in Man, the State and War from a gender perspective. But before I go on to say to paraphrase what she says about this, I think you do need context here, part of which she gives and part of which I'm putting in. I think part of one needs to realise that her relationship both to gender studies and to the study of war is deeply ambiguous in lots of different ways. On the one hand, her book Women of War, I think most people would say is a recognised classic in the field of gender studies in war. Even those people who don't agree with it would recognise that. On the other hand, she's somebody who is an intensely controversial figure within the gender studies movement, and especially within feminist circles. I mean, intensely controversial is a nice way of saying that they mostly hate her. She's somebody who is very much a critic of radical feminism and vice versa. I mean, if I can add in a personal anecdote, in 1998 I was BISA chair, and I invited her to give the annual plenary lecture at Leeds, I think it was. And she was the first woman speaker for years. Certainly it's first since Susan Strange. It doesn't count for this purpose. she gave a brilliant talk to about 350 people, but the gender group boycotted the meeting. They were sitting in the bar throughout, which suggests a level of hostility, which is I think it's a product of the American culture wars, frankly. I mean, that's how lots of things are. And just again, anecdotally, she and Bill used to be John Conley used to be very close friends. They don't speak anymore, which I find sad as a friend of both of them. So a very controversial figure. And the controversy she has with feminism feeds over into the discussion here, because one of the points about Jean's work since the 70s is that she believes that both the concepts of the state and concepts of the citizen need to be rethought but not dispensed with. There's a sense in which her critique of Ken's work is that she wants to defend a lot of first and second image thinking. Her critique of a lot of radical feminism is that she wants to defend notions of the state and citizenship. She doesn't believe in a state, in a world in which the state is transcended. What she'd like to see is the state changed in dramatic kinds of ways to become much more an organ of justice, and her notion of what citizenship should involve is different from much conventional thought. But I think partly because of those two basic positions, she finds herself in a situation where, in this paper, she's actually engaging in a kind of war on two fronts. On the one hand, she's confronting a lot of feminist writers. On the other hand, she's confronting the way Ken Waltz sets up the problem. So throughout the paper, I think you can see that bouncing backwards and forwards. She wants to say that the three images, singly and collectively, should be subjected to critique. But she also wants to say something very critical about many of the other critics of these images. I think this is very clear with the first two images. The first image gets to the human psyche, and she endorses Waltz's critique of first image optimists. And in this, she includes a lot of feminist writers, those people who believe that it is possible, on basis of changing human nature and shifting human nature, to produce a different kind of world, a world without war. But, and again, totally predictably in terms of everything else she's ever written, she's unhappy with his treatment of first image pessimists, and in particular the whole Augustinian tradition. From her point of view, that's at the heart of her politics, I think it's fair to say. Augustine is central, and that tradition means an awful lot to her. And her sense is that the critique that Ken offers of that is nowhere near as deep and compelling as the critique he offers of first image optimists. She also in this talks a lot about Freud, and quite interestingly here, about the way in which Freud sets the whole issue up, some controversies Freud had with Einstein. What she likes about Freud, and this is a point she wants to make more generally, is that Freud actually explodes the distinction between the three images. That he wants to say that if you want to explain war, you have to do man, the state, and the system. And she has what I think is, again, an interesting question, I think, for Ken, which is that's about 48 for tomorrow afternoon, if you give you a count, we'll remind you. How easy is it to combine things from different images? Can you actually say one of the three images is done? What she, I think, wants to say is that you have to pull all three together. Is this a legitimate strategy? I think Hidemi actually was talking a bit about this in his paper tomorrow. And I think she raises some kind of interesting questions here. Can we actually bring bits together from all three images? Because I think she argues plausibly enough that when Freud talks about these issues, Freud does want to do precisely that. And there's a sense in some readings of Ken's work that this is an illegitimate step. And so she wants to ask, is it actually an illegitimate step? And if it is, there may be a problem. Her discussion of the second image, and here I've got to admit to my own slight confusion, and if anyone's a better reader of the paper than I am, they're welcome to come back on this one. I find what she's saying here a little confusing at times. She certainly has I think if I'm reading her right, well, one thing she certainly does is talk about Jane Addams as a critic of both radical feminism, well, that's an anachronistic position, well, both of them are anachronistic, and the kind of Waltzian rejection of somebody who talks about different kinds of state, the kind of state that could exist as being a major force for peace. But at the same time, while promoting Addams's work, she seems to some extent, to my reading at least, to be slightly undermining the point she's making herself. I mean, she quotes Addams' account of a kind of melting pot in Chicago and saying it actually works there, or did work up to a point at least. But she then goes on to make the point that that was within a context of a domestic political order which laid down various constitutional rules and said how you could conduct arguments, which seems to me to play into Ken's point here, that the absence of such a structure internationally undermines that. She shows, I think, a lot of sympathy for liberal peace theory. Very little sympathy for critics of liberalism, and certainly, again, the attacks on radical feminism come in very, very strongly here. I think, as I say, she has positive things to say about the kind of earlier generation of feminists before the moderns, but ultimately I find that the way the argument develops at this point is not wholly clear to me, so I'm slightly letting her down in saying that I'm not actually putting over her argument, but I think I'd let her down a lot more if I pretended I got it and I actually didn't. So I'm afraid we're just going to have to live with that. And I think this is a draft that I suspect would have been open to quite a few changes if she'd have had the opportunity to make them. She is, I think, rather ill at the moment, which is why she's not here. I think in the case of the third image, it seems to me she's got much less to say, partly because what she does have, she had a nice title for this. The title of this section is War Happens, which presumably is a Rumsfeldian line, which is actually a rather nice one. In fact, her subtitles are pretty good. I should have read them out as we went along, but that's quite a nice one. I think the reason she hasn't got so much to say about the third image is because if you've already argued that you can't dispense with the first two, she's in a position where she doesn't actually have to say too much about the third image, and in a way the third image might be part of the story, but she's not going to buy into a kind of logic of explanation that places the whole emphasis at this one level. The state has to be part of any story, and women, the state of war requires a deeper exploration of the identity of citizens, of women in their civic capacities, and indeed everybody else in their civic capacities. So the final level, I think, the third image, she's basically saying that there's not too much you can do with this without what you have to do to the other two levels. She ends up by setting out a kind of project which has a number of points, I think, which may sound fairly obvious, but actually are more interesting than they suggest. A hermeneutic enterprise which looks in terms of four areas. Texts as contested terrains. Contesting the discursive terrain is not unique to feminism. It's become part and parcel of many challenges to discursive practices. So she's arguing that we need to reread a lot of the major figures, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Clausewitz, and others, who are drawn in as apologists for raison d'etre. And she argues, and again I think correctly, that the way in which many of these writers are read in the realist 20th century realist canon is not always enormously sophisticated way. That if you look at a figure like Machiavelli, he's much deeper than he's usually given credit for example. She talks secondly about the politics of identity, talking about her own work on women and war, looking at collective, historically constructed, ongoingly reinscribed exemplars, how they came into play in war and war making. If you remember Women and War, she talks about various identities, the beautiful soul, the just warrior, and so on. So I think she's basically arguing the importance of looking at identity, at rhetoric, the way in which identities are constructed in particular societies. Questioning the state. Now, as she says, she has no interest in destroying the state or smashing the state, even if that was possible, but she does argue that we need to place the state under question. We need to ask what the state is for, and here we get a quite strong medieval natural law sense of the role of political authority being about the delivery of justice and not simply about being a solution to collective actor problems. And that's my formulation, not hers, but I think that's more or less what she means. And again, rethinking power, the different kinds of notions of power. I think, in fact, all four of these elements of her enterprise are elements that we're all fairly familiar with, but I think she has interesting things to say about them. She ends up by asking us, in a sense, what if, a thought experiment, what if the current war-stroke-state system, as it's often tagged by feminist analysis, was suddenly to pass away? What conflicts would then occur? And she ends up with the kind of the sense which she attributes to Michael Howard, but I think it could be attributed to lots of people, that basically she believes the world without states would be a more, not a less violent world. And this gets back to the earlier point that she doesn't want to get rid of the state, she wants to rethink the state in lots of ways. She wants to rethink the nature of citizenship. Well, I think that's as good as I can do in terms of presenting her text here, and I think it would be quite interesting later if other people who read it read other aspects to it and thought other things were more important. But I'll stop there.
Well, it is an honor and pleasure to be here, though why I am here has escaped me. Until I realized I was a grad student of Ken Waltz. Having been a student of Barry Posen and Steve Van Acker on my thesis committee with the great, inimitable Hayward Alker, the three of them in the room with me. It was quite an experience. It's like a doubles match. Most of the time, Steve Van Ever's head was going. I have to say that I was deeply, deeply hurt yesterday. When my first book, Soviet Military Aircraft, was not put on the list of books, published in 1987, it sold a few thousand copies. Indeed, I know who purchased the book. The publisher kept a list. As I recall, among the buyers were the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and several Soviet military and political organizations. Apparently they didn't know what they had. Which suggests that what one considers the indispensable depends first on what you want to know, and second, what you want to do. Or as Habermas would say, it depends on your knowledge interests. My knowledge interests are, and always have been, transparently and urgently emancipatory. I want to know not just how the world works, but how we can make it work better and meet human needs and enhance the possibilities for human fulfillment. I'll try to do that in this talk, to try to get to that point, how we might do that. But first, I want to ask you to do an exercise with me. I'd like you all to raise your right hand, or if you're left-handed, please raise your left hand. Please do this with me. And make a circle clockwise. Clockwise. Make a circle clockwise with your whole arm, actually, with your whole arm. Now bring it down. Bring it down. Now look at this circle. Which direction is it going? Okay. That's what I want to do today with you. I want you to do that with me. I'm not even going to say what that is. Man in the mirror. Realists ground their theories of international relations, international politics, and assumptions about human nature. As Morgenthau says in Politics Among Nations, politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. The operation of these laws being impervious to our preferences, men will change them only at risk of failure. Classic realists like Hobbes and Morgenthau stress human aggressiveness, the drive for power, fear, rationality. We can't trust others in an anarchic context. Structural realists, like Waltz, argue that appeals to human nature are unnecessary because structure determines the recurrent features of international politics. I'm arguing, however, that Waltz does not entirely escape assumptions about human nature, and that his assumptions are essentially the traditional realist assumptions. Further, that those assumptions are consequential for theorizing from a structural realist perspective. Now, Waltz's discussion of human nature is rather nuanced. His use of the traditional human nature image is subtle. Nevertheless, in both Man, the State, and War and Theory of International Politics, Waltz assumes that our human natures are fixed, that we can't trust others, and that decision makers are essentially rational. Now, before John Mearsheimer rises to dispute the latter claim, or says that we should take this outside, let me remind you of what Waltz says in 1986 in his reflections on theory of international politics. As I said before, actors become sensitive to costs, which for convenience can be called an assumption of rationality. In his Adelphi paper on the spread of nuclear weapons, Waltz is also assuming a rational attention to costs. He says, where nuclear weapons threaten to make costs more immense, who will dare to start them? Nuclear weapons make it possible to approach the deterrent ideal. Waltz also assumes fixed human nature and distrust on pages 41 and 168 of Man, the State, and War. Further, Waltz repeatedly argues that we can assume conflict is inevitable. Waltz also appeals to earlier authorities who themselves held strong and particular views of human nature. He says, from Machiavelli through Meineke and Morgenthau, the elements of the realpolitik approach and the reasoning remain constant. Now note in the next bit how Waltz leaps from assumptions about human nature, the ruler's interests, as defined by these theorists, to the nature of the state. He says, the elements of realpolitik exhaustively listed are these: the ruler's and later the state's interests provide the spring of action. The necessities of policy arise from unregulated competition of states. Calculation based on these necessities can discover the policies that will best serve a state's interests. Success is the ultimate test of policy, and success is defined as preserving and strengthening the state. In this way, by referring to these other theorists, Waltz imports the realist view of human nature. Thus, I will strongly assert that both realists and neo-realists' assumptions depend on a particular view of human nature. I'm going to summarize these as three propositions. First, there is a sharp distinction between nature and nurture. Second, human nature is fixed. We can do little to modify our basic nature. And third, this human nature is characterized by tendencies, as I've said, to be hostile, aggressive, fearful, and distrustful. This group may not subscribe to every one of these propositions in such a clear way, but in general, they tend to add up to these three propositions. They conclude that fixed human nature is determines our culture and political institutions. For example, just about an hour ago, a little more than an hour ago, John Mearsheimer said, human nature explains why states pursue power. That's a direct quote. I argue that these assumptions and conclusions have directly shaped both the theorizing and policy prescriptions offered by realists and neo-realists. I argue that these assumptions are both inadequate and mistaken, that the theories and policy prescriptions need revision in the light of a reformulated understanding of human nature. Specifically, I offer three alternative propositions. First, there is no sharp distinction between nature and nurture at a biological and social level. Biology and social institutions are co-constitutive. And actually, you do say something like this in one page of Man the State more. I can trot out the quote for you if you like. Second, humans are variable and revisable at the biological and social level. Third, our biology can enable and foster both aggression and gentle cooperation, fear and trust, hostility and empathetic affection. I attempt to give enough detail in the paper about the biology to persuade you of these propositions. In particular, I focus on neuroscience. I'm not going to go into that detail now. I'll just highlight a few biological processes, epigenesis and plasticity, to make my general points to give support for the three propositions. First, epigenesis, that is, genes aren't simply blueprints or wiring diagrams. The expression of single genes depends on both the internal biological environment and the external natural and social environment. For instance, the identical twin of a person with schizophrenia has a 50% probability of becoming schizophrenic. Second, plasticity. Our brains are characterized by significant malleability. They are revisable as a consequence of experience, that is, internal experiences or external experiences. Specifically, the number of neurons can grow, the strength of reaction between neurons can increase or decrease, the size and activity level of different brain structures can change. For example, meditation can increase the size of your cerebral cortex, in case you're worried about decline. What does all that neuroscience mean for our theories of international politics and for policy? I focus on the implications in one area, the relation of our theories of deterrence to our understanding of fear. Deterrence theory assumes that threats that are sufficient and credible work by creating fear of adverse consequences in their targets. Policymakers often assume that the fearful back down. We can expect the targets to both be afraid and to do sophisticated assessments of our intentions and high-quality analysis of the options and likely consequences of various alternatives. Yet we know deterrence threats often fail and they frequently backfire. I argue that this failure is due to a misunderstanding of how fear works. When a person perceives a threatening signal, neurons in the amygdala, in the middle of the brain essentially, there's a diagram in the paper if you're interested in this location, send neurochemicals to other areas of the brain. The hippocampus, affecting memory, the locus coeruleus, affecting alertness, the hypothalamus, which releases our flight or fight chemicals, notably cortisol, and the prefrontal cortex, that is in the front of the brain where we do our reasoning. Now, the fear system has to have all those things working. So when it's working well, it fires when faced with a threat. All those other parts of the brain become engaged. It shuts off when the threat has passed or been dealt with. And it distinguishes between real threats and non-significant threats. Now, we wish that DoD could do this. Long-term fear, or even a single traumatic event, can reshape the chemistry and structure of the brain. Stimuli that are not dangerous can come to be responded to as though they were. We become hypervigilant. Fear affects both memory and cognition. When afraid, we are more likely to recall other events that provoked fear. Fear leads to reasoning by analogy, using other fearful events. So if we think that brandishing a pistol led to compliance in the past, we may bring out the pistol again. Fear also affects the ability to reason by shutting down the prefrontal cortex to a certain extent. So we have a diminished ability to weigh costs, risks, and benefits. We have a diminished capacity as well to see how our behavior, in fact our threatening behavior, may affect others. But the amygdala, this central organ for fear, can be moderated by the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. That's an important fact to keep in mind. We can moderate the effects. Nevertheless, it's relatively easy to ratchet up or go up a spiral with individual fear. Now, again, I've only been describing the effects of fear at an individual level. What about the political level? I make 3 arguments. First, fear can become institutionalized within organizations as standard operating procedures and beliefs, and also as patterns of action and reaction between groups. Institutionalized fear may become, secondly, a perceptual filter. And third, fear may become a self-sustaining climate. An example of the institutionalization of fear, when beliefs about fear structure the arrangement of organizations and their standard operating procedures, is the adoption of particular military strategies, such as the Schlieffen Plan or the Bush Doctrine. Fear affects perceptions and reasoning by analogy when threats are put on the fast track and disconfirming evidence is downplayed or ignored. So the early Bush administration's emphasis on capability-based planning is an illustration of this. And we all know capabilities-based planning is when you look to see what the adversary might do, not what they are necessarily planning to do. Fear may become self-sustaining, independent of its initial trigger, because it is institutionalized and becomes a perceptual filter. The US-Soviet confrontation is a paradigm example. Yet deterrence strategies depend on the deliberate production of fear. How wise is that? The deliberate production of fear in others is risky and likely does not operate in the way deterrence theory predicts. But the deliberate production of fear is at the root of these strategies. The rational actor will respond to credible threats of unacceptable damage, the theory predicts, by backing down. In Arms and Influence, Thomas Schelling says, it is the threat of damage or more damage to come that can make someone yield or comply. It is latent violence that can influence someone's choice. It is the expectation of more violence that gets the wanted behavior if the power to hurt can get it all. Well, sometimes. US policymakers assume that threats work and have set about deliberately trying to frighten foreign policy decision makers elsewhere. In December 2002, as the buildup for war against Iraq grew, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld reminded all, including North Korea, that the US could fight more than one war at a time. In May 2003, Bush administration officials, fresh from victory with Iraq, wondered aloud whether the North Koreans had gotten the message. Specifically, administration officials were said to be speculating that North Korean leader Kim Jong-il had gone into seclusion during the period immediately preceding the US war against Iraq because he feared a US attack himself. One senior Defense Department official told the New York Times, truly, if I'm Kim Jong-il, I wake up tomorrow and I'm thinking, have the Americans arrayed themselves on the peninsula now, post-Iraq, the way they arrayed themselves in Iraq? The way they arrayed themselves in Iraq rather than the way they were pre-Iraq? The official argued, the idea is to make the North Koreans realize that we are arrayed, that we are deployed, we are committed in Korea with the types of resources and types of capabilities that we brought to Iraq. And we think that doing that will make our deterrence there much more credible and stronger. That's wonderful. The traditional rational actor view of foreign policy decision makers de-emphasizes the effects of fear on perception, cognition, and memory on the assumption that humans are rational calculators. Yet threats may only increase the adversary's intransigence precisely because the target is actually frightened and angry, triggering a cascade of both individual and institutional responses. This may explain why, despite the United States' overwhelming power in the run-up to both the 1992 Gulf War and the 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom, Saddam Hussein did not respond to threats by backing down. It may also explain why Iran and North Korea did not respond to US threats in the recent past by dismantling their nuclear programs. Instead, Iran has proceeded with a program it says is not aimed at producing nuclear weapons, while North Korea tested nuclear weapons in 2006. In the North Korean case, it appears that diplomacy was more effective at prompting the North Koreans to put their nuclear weapons program on hold in 2008. So threats against Authoritarian regimes may be particularly prone to failure because those regimes' decision makers are already operating at high levels of fear. The phenomenon of long-term potentiation, which I discussed in the paper, suggests that the already frightened and stressed may be unable to distinguish between neutral and threatening stimuli and may overreact to either. Simple balancing strategies may be seen as aggressive and trigger a hyperactive response. At the level of foreign policy decision-making, fear may not only increase the tendency to misunderstand or dismiss the adversary's point of view, but it may also cause decision-makers to ignore divergent interpretations, or even stifle internal disagreement and dissent. Those who are afraid tend to look for more threats. The fearful tend to rally around the flag and attempt to bolster their sense that they are right. This, in turn, bolsters groupthink. Focusing on fear and anger may suggest why some regions seem to have long periods of war and crisis. Each crisis feeds the spiral of fear and distrust, and generations may go up primed to fear their neighbors. Protracted and intergenerational conflicts are probably those where the balance of underlying biology has shifted toward hyper-arousal among elite decision makers on both sides. Individual and group perceptions of repeated insults lead to anger, which tends, like fear, to decrease the quality of information processing while at the same time increasing group confidence and the willingness to take risks. As Booth and Wheeler argue, security dilemmas are both about interpreting the other's motives, intentions, and capabilities, and about determining a response. Fear thus keeps security dilemma action-reaction dynamics that produce a spiral of mutual hostility and escalation active. Fear is obviously not the only important emotional relationship between groups or states. The degree of empathy and trust that groups feel toward one another may account for the quality of their relationship. Richard Rorty has argued that dehumanization accounts for ethnic cleansing, while increased sentimentality and empathy account for our willingness to intervene in such conflicts. Some historical cases suggest that development of empathy over long periods of time can have important political consequences. For example, increased empathy accounts in part for the end of legalized slavery and formal colonialism. And Lynn Hunt argues that the development of human rights over the long term depends on the development of greater sympathy and empathy towards others starting in the 18th century. Regions characterized by security communities or successful post-conflict peace building may have achieved their success by first ratcheting down the effects of fear and gradually increasing the effects of empathy and the capacity to trust. Indeed, the literature on fear and empathy I've reviewed suggests that confidence-building measures such as data exchanges, cultural exchanges, and exercises in conciliation, the graduated reduction in tension, graduated reciprocation and tension reduction, GRIT, are extremely important if understudied by political science. Trust building and maintaining mechanisms must be institutionalized in routine practices and expectations to have the greatest effects. Okay, so what difference does human nature, old or new, make? As Waltz demonstrated 50 years ago, both optimistic and pessimistic notions about human nature have shaped many theories of world politics. While Waltz was right to warn international relations theorists from an overemphasis on human nature, he was wrong to suggest that human nature was both negative and fixed. I've argued that despite Waltz's attention to systemic factors, assumptions about human nature also shaped the development of structural realism. Negative views of human nature support those practices and institutions that depend on those views. If we believe that the escalation of conflict into war is inevitable, then its occurrence is understood as natural. A view that humans strive for domination, that domination and hierarchy are natural and inevitable, supports those who benefit from domination and hierarchy. I've suggested we both acknowledge the persistence of these Hobbesian assumptions and re-examine their validity. The question about man should no longer be, as Waltz phrased the debate between pessimists and optimists a half-century ago, whether humans are naturally aggressive or peaceful, or whether human nature is fixed or can change, or whether it is nature or nurture that determines our drives, predispositions, or capacities. Human biology, if that is how we define human nature, clearly has powerful, aggressive, and peaceful capacities that respond powerfully to environmental stimuli, including socialization and institutional context. And in the paper, I talk about empathy and mirror neurons and oxytocin. I haven't discussed the sort of positive side, but you can read that if you'd like. Anthropologists and historians have long described the diversity and malleability of social institutions and cultural practices, suggesting that simplistic views of human nature rooted in biological determinism are mistaken. Neuroscience confirms these findings. As Richard Rorty argues, there's a growing willingness to neglect the question, what is our nature, and to substitute the question, what can we make of ourselves? We have come to see that the only lesson of either history or anthropology is our extraordinary malleability. We're coming to think of ourselves as the flexible, protean, self-shaping animal, rather than as the rational animal or the cruel animal. In Man, the State, and War, Waltz argues that human nature is so complex that it can justify every hypothesis we may entertain. Our biology is complex, but that does not mean that we ought to give up trying to understand the complex ways that our biology and social institutions interact. Thus, it should be clear that I do not intend to reduce all to biology. Neuroscience can tell us about our basic biological capacities, but social science, psychology, and philosophy can better help us understand why we do what we do. Biologists are finding that we are shaped in nearly equal parts by nature and nurture. Our biology matters, but we are not prisoners of it. Our biological natures and our institutions interact. Our cognitions, memories, and emotions also interact at a neurological, neuroanatomical level. Moreover, because of the human capacity for reflection and reason, we can understand and manipulate the forces that shape us. It is therefore important to attend to the complexities of the interaction. Specifically, we must attend to the ways that institutions can reinforce aspects of our natures that promote conflict, but conversely, how institutions can engender cooperation. Similarly, we must attend to the ways our cognitions and emotions interact, influencing not only the process and content, of our cognitions, but how much and what we feel. In other words, while our amygdalas might react nearly instantaneously to perceived threat, our prefrontal cortex and hippocampus react nearly as quickly and can direct our behavior. Further, because we are social animals that live in community and must make decisions and act together to achieve goals, we must argue and persuade others about how to interpret situations and how to act. I'm thus ultimately in agreement with Waltz and Rousseau in one sense. The structures we make matter, and in some ways powerfully determine the kind of world we create. Where I disagree strongly with Waltz is in assuming that attention to human nature, understood as biology, is reductionist. Waltz argues that competition and power balancing are to be expected in anarchic systems, and that the international system is stable in the sense that disrupted balances will be restored in one way or another. The simple fact is that humans have structured world politics on the basis of assumptions about human nature. Namely, about fear, rationality, and distrust. Those assumptions have been institutionalized and become the system. Both our fears and our beliefs about how fear works make this system. We need not wait for human nature to change for world peace to become possible, nor should we lament the capacity of human nature to change. Our biology has all the capacity we need. We can shape our institutions and foreign policies to work more or less better with our biology. And this is where Jean Elshtain's argument with what she calls the radical feminists is mistaken. They're not saying we change human nature. They're saying our human nature has all the capacities we need, if we look at all of them. The realist tendency to assume that we know all we need to know about Homo politicus has likely done scholars of foreign policy decision-making an enormous disservice. In assuming that distrust is natural, we have done too little research on empathy and trust, and spent too little effort in devising policies to promote trust. Moreover, research on fear suggests that long-held assumptions on deterrence theory are probably not simply wrong, but dangerously so. Decades of research in political psychology has shown, and I think Richard Mendelboe wrote the sentence that deterrence is inadequate as an explanatory theory of international relations because the growing body of empirical evidence does not support the theory. The notion that deterrence threats can be manipulated with great confidence is therefore folly. We cannot expect decision makers to respond to threats by doing elaborate or even boundedly rational calculations of costs, risks, and benefits, yet policymakers are still counseled as if this were possible. This is not simply because signaling resolve is difficult. Fear and also anger and perceived humiliation affect the ways people reason and react to threats. Fear is a powerful source and reinforcer of both the cognitive and motivational biases that interfere with the communication and reception of deterrent threats.
Sorry, Nita, can you just write it?
Yes, I'm sentences away. Fear can become institutionalized and self-reinforcing to the extent that our beliefs, to the extent that our theories uninformed by research on fear have guided decision makers and shaped foreign policies by promoting the use of threats. They have made the world more dangerous rather than less. The path to decreased tension, conflict resolution, and improved security lies in re-examining the relationship between human nature, political practices and institutions, and in devising policies that actually decrease fear and enhance trust.
Thank you very